Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Today we explore Italy's long road from unification to the Great War, a nation desperate for prestige among Europe's giants. This is the story of how Italy abandoned old allies, embraced new promises, and entered World War I in search of honor, only to pay a staggering price. In 1871, the dream of a united Italy was finally realized. For centuries, the Italian peninsula had been divided kingdoms, duchies, and foreign powers carving it into pieces. Now, for the first time since the days of Rome, the tricolor flew over a single nation. Yet, in the grand concert of Europe, this new kingdom was treated almost like an upstart. Britain-France, Germany, Austria-Hungary. These were empires with deep roots, vast colonies, and mighty armies. Italy, by contrast, was fragile, new, and searching for respect. Still, the hunger for prestige burned fiercely. The Italian leadership knew that political unification was not enough. To stand tall among the great powers, Italy had to prove itself through economic progress, and perhaps more importantly on the battlefield. A nation once mocked as a mere geographical expression was desperate to show it had earned a seat at the table of empire. This desperation would shape Italy's choices in the decades to come. Bold ambitions, colonial dreams, and risky alliances would drive the young kingdom onto the global stage, but always with a shadow of doubt, could Italy truly stand as an equal among Europe's giants, or was it destined to stumble, paying dearly for its aspirations? After unification, Italy sought leaders who could turn dreams into stability. King Victor Emmanuel III, though not the most imposing monarch of his age, symbolized continuity and national unity. The true architect of Italy's modern growth, however, was Giovanni Giolitti. Serving multiple terms as prime minister between 1892 and 1921, Giolitti presided over a transformative era. Under his guidance, Italy's economy began to stir. Railways expanded, factories multiplied, and cities like Milan and Turin grew into industrial hubs. Between 1900 and 1914, steel and textile production surged, and workers streamed into urban centers, chasing opportunities their parents had never imagined. Italy was changing, and on the surface it seemed the kingdom was entering a golden age of progress. But beneath the optimism, a sense of inferiority lingered. Italians knew that while their industries were advancing, they paled in comparison to the titans of Europe. France and Germany boasted booming economies, colonial networks, and scientific achievements that dwarfed Italy's modest gains. To much of Europe's elite, Italy was still a junior partner, eager, energetic, but ultimately weaker. This paradox defined the nation. Progress was undeniable, yet prestige remained elusive. For Italy, the question was not whether it could grow, but whether that growth would ever be enough to demand the respect it so desperately craved. By the early 1880s, Italy faced a dilemma. How could a young, vulnerable kingdom secure itself in a Europe dominated by empires centuries older and far stronger? The answer came in the form of alliances. In 1882, Italy joined with the German Empire and Austria-Hungary to form the Triple Alliance. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. With two powerful empires as partners, Italy could finally shield itself from its greatest fear, France. Ever since French troops had crushed Italian colonial ambitions in Tunisia, Rome viewed Paris not just as a rival, but as a direct threat to its survival. The alliance promised protection, binding Germany and Austria-Hungary to defend Italy if France ever struck. Yet the pact was never one of equals. Italy entered not from a position of strength, but from vulnerability, clutching its security in a dangerous world. The treaty's terms reflected this imbalance. If Austria and Russia went to war, Italy had to remain neutral. If Germany and France clashed, Italy was expected to stand ready. It was a web of obligations carefully worded but not designed with Italy's interests at heart. Still, in the minds of Italian leaders, the alliance meant legitimacy. No longer an isolated newcomer, Italy was seated at the same table as Berlin and Vienna. But beneath the surface, mistrust simmered, especially toward Austria-Hungary, whose control of Italian-speaking lands along the Alps remained a bitter wound in the nation's pride. The Triple Alliance gave Italy a voice in European politics, but it also locked the kingdom into a relationship fraught with suspicion, compromise, and uneasy promises. While Italy's position in Europe was complicated, its leaders looked southward for a chance to prove themselves. The late 19th century was the age of empire Britain ruled from Cairo to Cape Town. France sprawled across North and West Africa, and Germany was carving out colonies of its own. Could Italy, newly unified, afford to be left behind? The answer in the eyes of Rome was no. Italy seized Eritrea and Somalia on the Horn of Africa, imagining them as the first stepping stones to a grand overseas empire. But ambition outpaced reality. In 1895, Italian forces marched into Ethiopia, expecting a swift and glorious victory. What followed was one of the greatest humiliations in European colonial history, the Battle of Adwa. Here, Ethiopian warriors armed with rifles and guided by Emperor Menelik II shattered the Italian army. The defeat was total. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed or captured, and the myth of European invincibility was broken by an African kingdom that refused to bow. For Italy, the loss was devastating. The dream of colonial prestige had turned into national disgrace. Newspapers called it a national wound, and politicians faced outrage at home. Yet instead of abandoning empire, Italy grew even more determined. The failure at Adwa became a scar on the national psyche, one that leaders vowed must someday be avenged. Italy had been humbled, but not silenced. Its eyes would soon turn westward toward another corner of North Africa, Libya. By the dawn of the 20th century, Italy's humiliation in Ethiopia still lingered. But where one door closed, another seemed to open. Libya, a territory under the waning control of the Ottoman Empire, became the new target of Italian ambition. The idea was not new. Since 1877, Italian governments had quietly claimed that Libya belonged within their sphere. Italian newspapers painted the region as a land of promise, lush with water, fertile soil, and untapped mineral riches, an image far more generous than reality. Politicians seized upon this vision, convincing the public that Libya was Italy's natural colonial destiny. By 1911, the drumbeat for war grew louder. Nationalists called it a chance to restore pride after Adwa, to win the respect of Europe through conquest. Italy's press joined in with striking propaganda, portraying Libya as not only rich, but also weakly defended. Just 4,000 Ottoman troops stood guard, they insisted, and reinforcements would be impossible for an empire already sick and crumbling. The promise was simple. Libya would be an easy victory, a cakewalk that would transform Italy into a true colonial power. But as history would soon prove colonial, dreams often looked far simpler on paper than they did on the battlefield. Even before the first shot was fired, Italy sought to cloak its ambitions in diplomacy. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti understood that seizing Libya would anger the Ottoman Empire, but he also knew Italy could not afford to act without the quiet approval of Europe's great powers. Throughout 1911, Giolitti carefully maneuvered in diplomatic circles, whispering Italy's intentions to London, Paris, and even Berlin. The responses were lukewarm, but telling. None of the powers moved to block Italy's plans. In the age of empire, colonial grabs were almost expected, provided they did not upset the balance of power too much. Sensing Italy's determination, the Ottomans attempted compromise. They offered a proposal: Libya would remain under nominal Ottoman suzerainty, but in practice, Italy would govern it. To many, it was a clever solution. Rome would gain control without the bloodshed of war. But Giolitti and the Italian press dismissed the offer. Symbolism mattered. Italy needed not just influence, but a visible conquest that could erase the humiliation of Ethiopia. And so, on September 29, 1911, Italy declared war. Rome had promised the public a swift victory, a colonial triumph that would prove the nation's strength at last. Yet as Italian troops prepared to embark for Libya, few realized how quickly the dream of an easy conquest would harden into something far more costly. When Italy's war against the Ottomans erupted in the autumn of 1911, enthusiasm swept across the nation. Newspapers trumpeted the campaign as a matter of destiny, while patriotic crowds cheered soldiers boarding ships bound for North Africa. Yet the army that disembarked in Libya was ill-prepared for the struggle ahead. Italy managed to field up to 100,000 troops, an impressive figure compared to the mere thousands of Ottoman defenders. But numbers alone did not guarantee success. The Italians lacked experience in desert warfare, underestimated their opponents, and relied heavily on the assumption that the Ottoman Empire, old and sickly, would crumble quickly. At sea, things looked more promising. The Italian Navy imposed its dominance, sweeping aside Ottoman vessels along the Libyan coast. Warships bombarded fortifications and secured supply routes, giving Italy clear control of the Mediterranean waters. On land, however, the reality was harsher. Italian columns advanced into an unfamiliar landscape of scorching heat, shifting sands, and determined resistance. Local Arab fighters alongside Ottoman officers waged a stubborn guerrilla war. Skirmishes, ambushes, and surprise attacks slowed Italy's advance. Victories that had been promised in weeks began to stretch into months, and what was meant to be a lightning triumph started to feel more like a long, grinding campaign. Italy had stepped onto the stage of empire, but instead of glory, it was about to learn the true cost of conquest. What Italy had promised as a swift cakewalk soon hardened into a grueling stalemate. By 1912, the Libyan war front bore little resemblance to the triumphant headlines in Rome. Italian troops, though well-equipped and numerous, found themselves pinned down in fortified coastal cities, while Ottoman officers and local Arab tribes waged a relentless war of attrition in the deserts beyond. Trench lines scarred the Libyan landscape. Soldiers huddled in shallow ditches under the punishing sun, trading sporadic gunfire with an enemy that seemed to melt into the sand after every attack. The Italians, frustrated, turned to new and untested methods of warfare. Airships floated above the front lines, dropping bombs on Ottoman and Arab positions, the first recorded instance of aerial bombing in human history. Armored cars. Another novelty rumbled awkwardly across the desert, their engines choking on sand, but they hinted at the mechanized wars of the future. For all the innovation, the fighting remained brutal and inconclusive. The Ottomans, though outnumbered, refused to yield. Local fighters knew the terrain, striking supply lines and vanishing into the desert. Every mile gained cost Italy dearly in men, resources, and morale. The war that had begun as a showcase of Italy's strength was now exposing its weaknesses. Instead of projecting confidence to the world, Italy appeared clumsy and overstretched an empire, still learning how to be an empire. After more than a year of stubborn fighting, the war in Libya finally ground to a halt. On October 18, 1912, Italy and the Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Ouchy, sometimes called the Treaty of Lausanne. On paper, Italy emerged victorious. The Ottomans agreed to cede Libya, formally recognizing Italy's colonial claim. Rome celebrated the acquisition as proof that the nation had at last joined the ranks of Europe's imperial powers. But behind the rhetoric of triumph lay harsher truths. The campaign had drained the treasury, costing Italy nearly 3 times the projected expense, 80 million lire each month, instead of the expected 30 million. Thousands of soldiers had perished, with some 7,000 Italian dead by the war's end. Worse still, the fighting had not truly stopped. In the Libyan interior, resistance continued as Arab fighters refused to accept Italian rule, foreshadowing years of insurgency and bloodshed. At home, the public's excitement soured into disillusionment. What was meant to be a quick and glorious war had dragged on, exposing Italy's fragile finances and shaky military leadership. The so-called military cakewalk had become a costly ordeal, one that left Italians wondering if the price of empire outweighed its rewards. Yet in the eyes of Europe, Italy had taken a step forward. It now possessed a colony wrested from the Ottomans. But victory came with a bitter taste, a reminder that prestige in the modern world demanded sacrifices that Italy was only beginning to understand. While the dust of Libya was still settling, Italy's leaders were already recalculating their position in Europe. Though bound by the Triple Alliance, Rome's trust in Austria, Hungary had always been fragile. The root of the mistrust was geography itself. Along the Alpine frontier, Austro-Hungarian rule extended over Italian-speaking lands, South Tyrol, Trentino, Istria. To Italian nationalists, these territories were not Austrian provinces, but unredeemed lands, pieces of Italy waiting to be reclaimed. This tension pushed Italy to quietly court old rivals. In 1902, years before the Libyan War, Rome had already signed a secret pact with France, pledging mutual neutrality should either side be attacked. It was a quiet betrayal of Austria and Germany, but one that reflected Italy's deeper instincts. The alliance with Vienna was a marriage of necessity, not of love. By the early 20th century, Italy had positioned itself as a nation, hedging its bets, keeping a foot in 2 camps. Publicly, it remained allied to the Central Powers, but behind closed doors it sought favor with Britain and France. Colonial rivalries, economic ties, and territorial disputes all pulled Italy closer to the Entente. To outsiders, this double-dealing may have seemed duplicitous, but to Italian leaders, it was survival. Their young kingdom had no choice but to balance carefully shifting loyalties as opportunities arose. The irony was clear in seeking security through alliances. Italy often found itself more entangled and insecure than before. In the summer of 1914, Europe erupted into chaos. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that plunged the continent into war. Austria-Hungary moved against Serbia. Germany stood at Vienna's side, and soon the Central Powers found themselves locked in conflict with France, Russia, and Britain. For Italy, the moment of truth had come. Bound by the Triple Alliance, many expected Rome to march immediately alongside Austria, Hungary, and Germany. Yet Prime Minister Antonio Salandra hesitated. The alliance, he argued, was defensive in nature, meant to protect against aggression. But in this war, Austria was the aggressor, striking first against Serbia. Italy, Salandra insisted, was not obligated to join. The announcement stunned Europe. Instead of plunging headlong into the conflict, Italy declared neutrality. Officially, the kingdom would wait and watch. Unofficially, its leaders saw an opportunity. By holding back, Italy could weigh the promises of both camps' Central Powers and Entente alike, and choose whichever side offered the greatest reward. For many Italians, neutrality was a relief. The nation was still recovering from the costs of the Libyan war. Its army was untested, its finances strained, and its people weary of sacrifice. Yet others saw hesitation as weakness, a betrayal of allies, and a missed chance for glory. In 1914, Italy stood on the edge of a vast storm, uncertain whether to stay sheltered or to leap into the maelstrom in search of prestige. Italy's neutrality alarmed its allies. For Germany and Austria-Hungary, the absence of Italian support left the southern flank dangerously exposed. Diplomats scrambled to salvage the alliance, offering Rome concessions in exchange for loyalty. Austria-Hungary dangled the possibility of handing over Trentino and the Austrian littoral lands Italians had long coveted. Yet when it came to Trieste and South Tyrol, the crown jewels of Italian nationalist dreams, Vienna hesitated. To surrender them, Austria believed would be to cut out pieces of its own heart. The offers rang hollow in Rome. Italian leaders saw them for what they were, half-measures, promises made in desperation, but not in sincerity. To many in Parliament, it was unthinkable to march into war alongside Austria-Hungary, the very empire that still held unredeemed Italy within its borders. The situation revealed the limits of the Triple Alliance. Though bound by treaty, the partners were never true friends. Italy's resentment toward Vienna ran too deep, and Austria's refusal to sacrifice meaningful territory only widened the rift. As the Central Powers clung to Italy with weak promises, another courtship was already underway, one that would soon change the course of Italy's destiny. While Vienna hesitated, the Entente moved boldly. Britain, France, and Russia understood that Italy's allegiance could tip the balance in the Mediterranean and on the Alpine front. In secret negotiations, they promised Italy what Austria would not: the lands of South Tyrol, Trentino, Istria, Dalmatia, and even distant territories along the Ottoman coast. Foreign Minister Sidney Sonnino, though cautious, recognized the magnitude of the offer. Here was a chance to fulfill the dream of Italia Irredenta the unredeemed Italy nationalists had demanded for decades. The deal was written into history as the Treaty of London, signed on April 26, 1915. It was a gamble cloaked in secrecy. Italy was still officially allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary, yet behind closed doors it had pledged itself to their enemies. To the Central Powers, Italy's silence suggested hesitation. In truth, Rome had already chosen. The treaty was more than a promise of land, it was a promise of prestige. By siding with the Entente, Italy could finally prove itself a decisive actor in European politics, not a junior partner hiding in the shadows. For Sonnino and his allies, the moment was intoxicating. Italy would enter the war not as a hesitant follower, but as a nation demanding its place among the great powers. What remained was to make the decision public and to unleash the storm it would cause at home. On May 3, 1915, Italy made its move. The kingdom formally withdrew from the Triple Alliance, severing ties with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The announcement echoed across Europe like the crack of a rifle. Italy had turned its back on its old allies. Inside Italy, the decision ignited fierce debate. Former Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, a voice of moderation, fought to keep the nation out of the conflict. Liberals and pacifists warned that Italy was not ready, that the scars of Libya still ached, that the treasury was thin, and that the army lacked the strength for a continental war. But their voices were drowned out by the chorus of nationalists. Writers, politicians, and fiery orators filled the streets with slogans demanding war to redeem Italy's honor and to claim the unredeemed lands. Crowds gathered in Rome and Milan, waving flags and chanting for intervention. To them, neutrality was cowardice. Only by joining the Entente could Italy seize its destiny. The government bent to the pressure. On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary. Bells rang, soldiers marched, and the public celebrated as if victory were already assured. Yet behind the patriotic fervor loomed a darker reality. Italy had just entered a conflict bloodier and longer than anyone could imagine, a war that would test not only its armies, but the very soul of the young nation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Italy stood among the victors, but at a staggering cost. The promises of the Treaty of London had lured Rome into the war, and at Versailles in 1919, Italy claimed some of the long-coveted prizes: Trentino, South Tyrol, Trieste, and Istria. These gains were hailed as the fulfillment of Italia Irredenta, proof that the nation had carved out its rightful place on the map of Europe. Yet the price was measured not only in territory, but in blood. More than 500,000 Italian soldiers never returned home, and countless more bore scars, physical and invisible, that would haunt them for decades. The economy already fragile before the war collapsed under the weight of debt and inflation. Veterans returned to villages that could no longer support them, fueling bitterness and unrest. Instead of unity, the aftermath brought division. Many Italians felt cheated, believing the Entente had failed to deliver all the territories promised in London. Nationalists called it a mutilated victory, a phrase that echoed through newspapers and public speeches, planting seeds of resentment. Amidst the chaos, new voices rose louder, harsher, more extreme. The war had given Italy land, but it had also given birth to movements that would soon demand power in the streets. From the trenches of the Isonzo to the halls of Versailles, Italy's struggle for recognition had left it stronger on the map, but dangerously fractured within. The nation had entered the Great War in search of prestige and emerged on a path that would reshape its destiny in the turbulent decades ahead.